Hello, and welcome to the 25th Williams Research Center Symposium, Recovered Voices, Black Activism in New Orleans from Reconstruction to the Present Day. I'm Jessica Dorman, Director of Publications here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. This year's program is a little different from the symposia we've run in the past, not only because it's taking place in virtual space, but because it's focused on books. And this weekend, you'll have a chance to meet the talented authors whose archival research has resurrected the voices of 19th century Black activists. Afro-Creole poetry in French, Economy Hall, and Monumental are remarkable works of scholarship, true labors of love. But they're not the only books that we've published here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. We have titles as varied as Furnishing Louisiana, a landmark in decorative arts scholarship, to Ernie Cato, Emperor of New Orleans, to a new biography of sculptor Enrique Alferez out this spring. We hope that you will visit the shop at the collection or your favorite local independent bookseller. Read these books, enjoy them, and then reach out. You can visit hnoc.org/books for our submission guidelines. We're always looking for new book manuscripts. Who knows, maybe the next recovered voice will be yours. Thanks so much and enjoy the symposium.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, as Jessica said at the top, to the 25th Annual Williams Research Center Symposium. My name is Nick Weldon, and I'm Associate Editor here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. I'll be moderating this afternoon's program, and I'm delighted that you all could join us. Before we get started, I do want to mention a couple of things. Our program will last approximately 1 hour. You'll be hearing from Brian Mitchell, Barrington Edwards, and me, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any time throughout the program by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We also have Spanish interpretation available thanks to the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. If you just click at the globe at the bottom of your screen, it will enable that feature. Last thing, we have a very brief survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the session, and we would appreciate it if you can fill that out for us. So with that, let's get started. I'm gonna just share my screen here. Bear with me one moment.
Deme un minuto, por favor.
All right. So today our presentation is titled Oscar Dunn's Radical Vision for Louisiana, which is based off of the collection's new and first graphic history, Monumental, Oscar Dunn and His Radical Fight in Reconstructing Louisiana, written by Brian K. Mitchell, who's here with me, and illustrated by Barrington S. Edwards, who will be joining us a little bit later. I'd also be remiss if I didn't recognize Tana Coleman, who designed Monumental and did the lettering for our comics pages, and without whom we wouldn't have this beautiful book to share with you all. So I want to quickly introduce you, Brian, and then turn it over to you for a moment. Brian Mitchell is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, as you probably saw in the slideshow to begin with. He's Associate Faculty at the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. He's a New Orleans native. He earned a PhD in Urban Studies at the University of New Orleans, and that's where he wrote the dissertation published in 2011 about Oscar Dunn. That was the foundation of this book. His research focuses on race, violence. He's done a lot of work on the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, where he is now, and his work has been featured by CNN, NPR, the Associated Press, all over the place. And so I want to start, Brian, by allowing you to introduce yourself. And time is constrained here, but I don't think we can tell the story of Monumental and Oscar Dunn without understanding your connection to Oscar Dunn and when you first heard of him. So maybe you can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. In 1976, I moved back to the city, and I went to a school, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, and while we were at the school, there was an assignment that we were doing in class, which was recalling previous governors and lieutenant governors of the state. I believe it was in second grade. And I'd gone home. I'd been at my grandmother's house a few weeks before, and I had looked through some scrapbooks that she had. and magazines, and she had an article in it, a tattered old article about Oscar Dunn. And I realized that Dunn shared the maiden name of my mother and my grandmother. And she had noted that he was a relative of ours and that he had been lieutenant governor. So when the assignment came up in class, I noted that there had been a Black lieutenant governor, and the teacher didn't believe me. She actually had no idea that there had been a Black lieutenant governor in the state. And I noted that not only had there been one, but there had been three. And with that, she got kind of upset and blew up at me. And as a kid, you know, in second grade, it sort of breaks your heart. So I went home and to my grandmother's, and she explained to me that not everyone remembers Dunn. Dunn had been forgotten in time. So this notion of forgetting someone as important to our identity as Dunn was fascinating to me at a very early age.
Yeah, and you know, I'm curious, you know, obviously there's a long gap from when you have this interaction to when you start researching Dunn, but suffice it to say, you end up on this path to becoming a historian and digging deeper into Dunn's origin story. And I wondered if, and I'm going to show here quickly some of the stuff that you've uncovered from some of our local archives here. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about Oscar Dunn's birth, his identity, his upbringing, because in our panels this weekend, we have a lot of conversation about the Afro-Creole population of New Orleans and their activism during the 19th century. And but Oscar Dunn's background is different. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how his background influenced his path and his relationships as he got older.
What's interesting about New Orleans at this time, and we're talking 1820s through the 1880s, is New Orleans is tackling not just one cohesive Black community, but two really separate communities, an Anglo-African community and an Afro-Creole community. And although both of them have origins in Africa, or at least partially have origins in Africa, the two communities are quite different in many ways. The Anglo-Africans are Protestants. Many of them are English speaking, and the Afro-Creoles are Catholic, and most of them speak French. So these two communities often are divided in many ways.
Nope. Let's see here.
Many of them are divided in many ways. And Dunn is sort of born immersed in both. He's born in the city of New Orleans. He speaks both English and French. He is Protestant in religious beliefs. However, he's able to navigate both worlds, which will be of distinct advantage to him when he goes into politics. He's also born a slave. And if you look at the document on the left, which was a totally new document, which was a document that hadn't been seen by researchers before, it is an index of a notary abstract, and it's for Dunn's cell. So the owner of Dunn at the time that he was a boy was a man by the name of George Phillips Bowers. And Bowers was a merchant in the city that lived in the French Quarter. So it's from the French Quarter that he emerges, and he is purchased by his stepfather, a man by the name of James Dunn, a free Black man from Petersburg, Virginia, who makes his way to New Orleans in 1819 to come build the first American theater for James Henry Caldwell. He also did the stage carpentry, so the stage sets his father was responsible for. And upon freeing Dunn, it opens up a whole new world to Dunn. Before being freed, he was just known as Oscar. That you didn't have a last name, And as a freeman, you have the privilege of having a middle and a last name. And it's no mistake that he adopts the last name of the man who freed him, his stepfather, becoming Oscar James Dunn. It also opens him up to a lot of freedoms. And one of the freedoms that he fully exploits is education. And he very quickly, even though we know that James Dunn could not read or write because he signs his contracts with the mark of an X, he thought enough of his stepson to send him to school to learn to read and write. And Dunn excels in school according to an account another early account that's written by him. And this account had not been seen. And this account is written by a close friend of Dunn, someone who had known him his entire life, a Freemason by the name of Parsons. And Parsons maintains that Dunn excelled in school, and that he not only did he love
En la
school, he
escuela.
enjoyed reading. He was an avid reader, and but you could not make a professional life for yourself. And his father, being an artisan, also decides to give him an additional form of education that could produce an income for him. And that was to apprentice him to a plasterer. So he's apprenticed to a plastering firm. And it's while he's working at this plastering firm that he learns the craft of being a master plasterer. This will be important to the records of Dunn because at some point he gets in a disagreement with his employers and he flees. And this will lead to an escapade by which the employer will put out an ad for his arrest and his return. And many people, many contemporary historians will confuse this ad and maintain that this was proof that he had been a slave and that he had run away from his masters. But this isn't at all about slavery. It's about him being an apprentice and working under these individuals and leaving a contract before that contract was completed.
Right. And there were definitely distinctions in those kind of notices that were posted at the time, even on the same page as that the notice ran on that talked about Dunn evading his job. There are references to enslaved persons who had escaped. And so there was a distinction, and that's something that you very acutely brought to light in your research here. And I want to fast forward a little bit because our time is limited, but he's plastering, he's also introduced to
Nuestro
music.
tiempo es limitado, entonces quiero introducir que él se volvió un instructor de música, pero en mi mente es un evento transformacional. En 1863, Lincoln firma una petición de la proclamación. Dunn es una persona libre en ese momento y él se mueve a la sociedad de benevolentes y donde él asistió.
For universal male suffrage. And I'm just going to go ahead here to some pages from the book where we can see Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation and some of the efforts led by Black men in New Orleans to petition him on the issue of suffrage. And this is really a turning point in his life where he goes from these humble origins as a plasterer and a musician into getting into the political ground. And so when we talk about Oscar Dunn as a radical, here he is on the ground floor of the suffrage fight in New Orleans. Maybe you can expand on that a little.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the gravest mistakes that we make when we sort of evaluate the Reconstruction Black politician, is that we look at these politicians as coming from these humble roots. But you have to realize that many of them were artisans because that is how they made a living. It wasn't that they weren't capable of greater things. It wasn't that they weren't intelligent or they lacked education. Those were the avenues of employment that were open to them. And for Dunn, the avenue of employment that was open to him was a plasterer. And as soon as something else opened up, he very quickly gravitated toward that. At the same time that he was a plasterer, he was a Mason, and he was rising in the Masonic ranks to the point where he led the Grand Lodge of the state, not once, but twice. And as being the head of the Prince Hall Masons in the state and being an active and an influential leader in the AME Church, that garnered him a lot of respect in the community in both the Afro-Creole sectors and the Anglo-American sector of the city. He was regarded by both communities as a leader, and he was trusted by both communities. And he also had another unique distinction of having been a slave. Many of the recently emancipated were very, very skeptical of
Y también era
other
muy,
leaders who had
no
slaves.
confiaba en otros
But
líderes que
Dunn,
habían
unlike
tenido
these other
esclavos en
leaders,
sí. Pero Dunn
was a slave himself, and he could always sort of call upon that when talking to the recently emancipated, and there was a trust there. And he protected them in many ways. And one of the things that he gravitated toward was protecting the interests of children who were involved in elaborate schemes to be re-enslaved under the guise of apprenticeship on farms. And he made sure that this didn't happen. And he made sure that orphan children who didn't have parents, that there were orphanages that were established and through his philanthropy and the philanthropy of other well-heeled African Americans.
Mhm. And maybe you can, one of his earliest endeavors in associating with freedmen, and you can see right here in the corner of the screen, is he opens an intelligence office, right, where he basically helps freed people find good work and fair pay. And maybe you can talk about that and how that helps him build this base in the state of Louisiana that trusts him.
One of the things that I've come to the conclusion about Dunn was he actually hated being a plasterer. And despite making a living that way, he was always looking to do something different. When he could become a music teacher, he became a music teacher. And when that avenue closed to him, he was always looking for another avenue to open. And the emancipation of the former slaves, the emancipation of slaves, actually gave him another avenue for employment. Planters still needed the labor that the enslaved people had provided. And he realized this. And he realized that there was an opening for someone who could negotiate contracts in trust with both communities, the white planters and the recently emancipated. And he was able to do this. And he did it with such skill that he was quite known for it and became pretty affluent for that time period. He quickly began to amass a following.
And we'll skip ahead here, but he we see here in the corner is, it's around this time during the suffrage fight that he becomes introduced to a man named Henry Clay Warmoth, who was a young man in his 20s, a war veteran who would ultimately be on the gubernatorial ticket with Oscar Dunn when he runs for lieutenant governor. And here we have a photo of Henry Clay Warmoth and PBS Pinchback, who was another prominent Black leader at this time who would factor significantly into Dunn's story. But again, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. But you're talking about freedmen and suffrage, and you just mentioned that Dunn began to accumulate a little bit of wealth. And what did he do with it? One thing he did here was that he funded a registration, a voluntary registration of Black voters in the state that they could then deliver to Washington, D.C. to try to convince the Republicans in power that suffrage was a viable political choice, right?
Yes, he does that as a leader of the Friends of Universal Suffrage. And they come up with a number of schemes. And one of the schemes is, first, we've got to convince Abraham Lincoln that he wants to enfranchise. He wants to push for the enfranchisement of Blacks. And to do this, they find two Afro-Creoles that they can send to Washington, D.C., that they believe exemplify what white men want most in African Americans. And they pick them for a number of reasons. One had been a veteran, one had trained at elite schools in France, and they send these individuals up to show this is what we have to offer. These are what the free blacks in New Orleans are like. And Dunn, when we talk about Lincoln's very last public speech, Lincoln mentions in length details about these men and about the potential for enfranchisement, at least partial enfranchisement of free blacks from the city of New Orleans. And he mentions like the examples of the men that had come from New Orleans to visit him. When we talk about the registration, what they had to show Republicans is that they had the numbers to take the state politically over. And to do this, they had to run a mock election and a registration. And that takes money, and it takes organization. And it's Dunn's money and organization that will fund this registration of the first Black voters in the state.
And this is hugely impactful. I mean, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's some more benevolent associations. We talk about Dunn's radicalism. He was the president of the People's Bakery, which was based off of European co-ops about, self-sufficiency for Black folks in New Orleans. You mentioned his, help with orphans and young Black children in New Orleans. And so zoom ahead now, and there's a huge event that we're having to skip over here, which is the Mechanics Institute Massacre, which changes everything. And I would encourage people to read. Jessica Dorman, our publications director, wrote a great article explaining what happens here. But basically, there's a massacre of Black delegates meeting to talk about suffrage, and it changes the game in New Orleans, and it leads to Dunn taking his first political office. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that happens.
After the passage of the 13th Amendment, and as people began to plan for the 14th and 15th Amendment, Blacks became more organized, and they began meeting and having conventions to sort of discuss the potential and what needed to be done in order to have the 14th and 15th Amendments passed. And one of these organizations met at the Mechanics Hall. And what's interesting about Mechanics Hall is that it shows a number of things. First, it shows the level of organization that was taking place in regard to preparations for 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And it also discusses the sense of a network that existed within not just free men, but also a network which exists within the Black community and the white community, because Dunn is warned not to go to Mechanics Hall. And he's warned by someone in the white community, warns him and says, look, it's not wise for you to go there. It's going to be violent. And just as they had speculated, violence breaks out and the delegates at Mechanics Hall are fired upon, and a massacre takes place. This is one of two big riots that take place in the summer of 1866. And these riots will engage Congress, the US Congress, and they will decide that it is far too early to pull out troops. In fact, they might need to better organize these troops and let the generals who are leading these troops govern the former Confederate states. So the former Confederate states are divided into a number of districts, and New Orleans, Louisiana becomes the 5th district, and Philip Sheridan becomes the leading general in that district. And what Sheridan does when he becomes the leader of the district is get rid of all of the former Confederates that are in government, because he realizes many of them had been involved in the organization of the 1866 riots and possibly Mechanics Hall. And he has this opportunity now to replace people in government. And Dunn is one of the first men that's selected to play a role in government. So he becomes one of the very first appointee, one of two of the very first appointees.
Right, and he joins what was then the City Council of New Orleans, the lower board, and while he's there, he also serves a term as an assistant recorder. So, as you point out in your research, he becomes the first Black man in Louisiana to serve in a judicial capacity. It's also here that he introduces a bill that fails that will effectively integrate public schools, which is a new concept at the time. Public schools in New Orleans, and it doesn't pass. But unfortunately, we have so much ground to cover here. But this is just evidence of Dunn's fight, for some of these radical policies, integrating public schools. This happened in 1867, and it would not come to fruition for another 4 years. So I want to show this picture here to the right here, which is a beautiful illustration that demonstrates what happens in 1868. Dunn is elected to lieutenant governor, and a number of Black men take their places in the Louisiana legislature. And Dunn is in the center of this network here. He is joined on the ticket by Governor Henry Clay Warmoth. And maybe, Brian, to kind of skip ahead a little bit, you can talk about how these two men diverge over this issue of civil rights. And the Civil Rights Bill, you can see here in Barrington's illustration here, there was an ominous veto that was a turning point in the relationship between Governor Warmoth and Lieutenant Governor Dunn.
After Dunn becomes lieutenant governor in 1868, a bill is brought before. In fact, one of the very first bills that's brought before the legislature was a new civil rights bill, and it's called the Isabelle Bill. It was coined after the Isabelle brothers who had proposed the bill. And Warmoth had been Dunn's guy up until that point. Dunn hand selected him and brought him to the Friends of Universal Suffrage. He had personally vouched for this individual. And now that Warmoth is governor and the bill comes across his desk, he vetoes that bill. And Dunn felt betrayed, as did all of the delegates who were all part of the Friends of Universal Suffrage that had embraced Warmoth, and taking a very much a more contemporary tone of this go slow. He maintains that they're not ready. The state is not ready for this sort of move toward equality, and it's at that point that there is a schism within the Republican Party. A radical faction led by Dunn breaks away from this conservative faction that is led by Warmoth. And pretty much an outright war begins between these two factions. And this will culminate it will culminate in the impeachment of Warmoth and the death of Dunn. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in between.
A lot of stuff in between there, yeah. And I wanted to skip ahead, but you mentioned this radical faction, and this is where Dunn, becomes aligned with the president, Ulysses S. Grant, who is supercharging, radical Reconstruction in the South. And, they basically become allied, and Grant has his history of discharging Warmoth. There's a whole lot of politicking that happens there, but suffice it to say that Dunn kind of becomes Grant's guy in Louisiana as he aligns with federal office holders at the New Orleans Custom House. But this becomes a factor in this split that you mentioned in Louisiana, is that the president doesn't really trust the governor, and sees more eye to eye with the Black lieutenant governor.
Yes.
So I want to jump ahead a little bit here because we're running out of time, and I want to pull Barrington in here shortly. But we mentioned another aspect where Dunn and Warmoth differ quite a bit, and Pinchback to a degree is over corruption. And this is really, maybe you can touch on this a little bit about how this ultimately is one of the downfalls of the Republican effort in Louisiana is corruption.
Initially, everyone, the Democrats opposed Dunn because of his Blackness. But what's interesting in the narrative of Oscar Dunn is he's able to transcend that in the minds of many Democrats. And it's really over this issue of corruption and what you can get away with in office. Dunn neither smoked, drank, or gambled. He didn't talk about religion because he knew that this was a very divisive thing in Louisiana. Instead, he talked about virtues in which all Christians sort of could embrace, whether Catholic or Protestant. He didn't take bribes, and he publicly sort of called out people who offered bribes to him, making him sort of the hero of the day because everyone knew that Warmoth was on the take, and Pinchback was known also to take bribes. So Dunn came out to be this general person of sterling reputation. And this would change the hearts and minds of many Democrats. And one of the Democrats who seems very swayed by Dunn and very impressed by Dunn was Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, who had turned him down for a rare first-class railroad ticket. He would later say, "I would prefer Dunn to Warmoth." So this notion that he would select a black man over a white man to be lieutenant governor. Another thing that Dunn does, it sort of changes the hearts and minds of individuals, is he was very even-handed as he presided in the legislature, making sure that room was made for the minority party, the Democrats at the time, and making sure that they had voice and that there were concessions that were made to them. He quite famously said, "A man cannot legislate himself into another man's parlor." And he realized that winning the hearts and minds of the white populace and working toward equality would likely not be done in a single generation. That's why he believed education and integrated education was so important. He saw that as an avenue where children may see each other as equals over time, and because of experiences and friendships that could have been built in classrooms.
And as I alluded to earlier, we finally see the fruition of his endeavors on integrated public education in January 1871, when by court order, several schools in New Orleans began to integrate. And something you point out is that Oscar Dunn enrolled his own children in this first class, his adopted children, of Black children, to integrate these schools in New Orleans. And I wish we had more time to talk about this because a lot of attention is rightfully given to the civil rights era, the civil rights movement of the 1950s. New Orleans had a civil rights movement in the 1870s. There were several years when thousands of Black and white children attended. About a third of schools in New Orleans, public schools at that time, were integrated. And Dunn, you would say probably led by example here, right?
Yes, not only did he realized that many people would not risk their children if just on the order of a politician telling them to do so. He really realized that he needed to put his money or his children where his words were. And he made sure that his children were among the first that were enrolled in schools to make this example that if I'm going to send my kids here and I feel safe and secure sending my children to this school, then you too can feel safe and secure in sending your children away to these schools that had been dominated by whites in the past.
And if you wonder, as we kind of wrap up, and I want to bring Barrington in here, of course, there was this moment where Oscar Dunn was acting governor and basically things fall apart with him and Warmoth. And we're going to have to leave our audience on a few cliffhangers here. And I encourage you all to check out Monumental. But suffice it to say, unfortunately, things kind of fall apart. In a way, this school integration in January 1871 is the high point, the last high point for Oscar Dunn. And, basically he dies while in office. And there's a shroud of mystery over what happens. And as you mentioned earlier, a year after that, Warmoth is impeached. PBS Pinchback steps into the acting governor position. And I just, there's a source that you discovered, which is this speech by a man named Thomas Morris Chester, who was a friend of Dunn's. This happened 2 weeks after he died. And it stuck with me. It's a key scene in the book. And it's something that I kind of want reader or listeners to think about a little bit in terms of Dunn's impact and the potential that his leadership represented that was cut short. And here, you know, we have this beautiful scene rendered by Barrington where, you know, he laments the loss of Dunn. A great man has fallen in Louisiana, but yesterday he moved among us all in the grandeur of an incorruptible official, a spotless patriot, an exalted citizen, and a polished gentleman. As you mentioned, his bipartisan support, men of every shade of political opinions have divested themselves of prejudice and testify to the purity of his private and public character. And then he goes on to make some accusations about Dunn's death. At this point here, I think I want to bring in our illustrator, Barrington Edwards. Barrington, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes. And Barrington, you know, Brian and I have been talking a lot about this story, and maybe you can talk about how you took all of this history. I mean, let me offer a little bit of an introduction. You know, Barrington S. Edwards, we found him on the recommendation from a talented illustrator himself, John Jennings. And Barrington is Boston-based. He earned his BFA in Communication Design and MS in Art Education at the Massachusetts College of Art. He's an award-winning artist and educator, an activist, and he's currently teaching at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And we were so fortunate to have you bring Brian's story to life. And I'm wondering, what was your approach to tackling this dense, complicated history in the city of, primarily taking place in the city of New Orleans?
Well, my approach was to listen and to look and to walk. There's no secret between you and I, Nick, that I have, and Brian, that I have a love affair with New Orleans and Louisiana in general, even though I am born and bred in Boston. It feels very like home to me. I've been several times, and my approach was to really go and listen to the story and honor the fact that this is a part of our history, like many, many, many nuggets of our history that have been overlooked. And I took the direction from you and the collection to really let the city tell the story and stay as true to things like the like this monument that we're in front of, like the cobblestones in the street, and all the rich history that New Orleans has to offer, and let that tell the story.
And I want to show a quick video here. I'm going to come out of my presentation, and bear with me just a moment. This is just an example of Barrington's artistic process. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the stages that went into forming these illustrations. And I chose this page in particular because it shows many important figures. We have Henry Clay Warren speaking to Abraham Lincoln. We have Ulysses S. Grant. We have Oscar Dunn and Governor William Kellogg there at the bottom. But I mean, this was a challenge of historical accuracy and of also creating characters that were compelling. And we really loved what you did with Warmouth in particular. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Oh, Warmouth, you scamp. As I said, the process was the process was really kind of stemming from you and from Brian and the amazing set of references in the collection. And so the collection is so rich with historical photographs and documents that, and half the work was done for me. So for me, to kind of tell the story efficiently and comprehensively, I tried to really find a middle ground. And I pride myself in being able to work in lots of different looks. So I tried to choose a general look for the characters and places and kind of brushstrokes that would allow me to kind of tell the story with some flow, but also tighten it in places so that the historical reference would feel authentic. Right now on my screen, I see I see still images. I'm not sure what the the video. I can't. I'm not narrating.
Oh.
I don't know.
Hopefully, folks are seeing. I'm showing a time lapse video of your rendering of some of these characters. But Brian, what surprised you most or excited you most about the way Barrington took your vision for this story and brought it to life?
There were a number of things that I loved about Barrington's work. One of the things that I will routinely say are the nightscapes of the city, and seeing the city beautifully rendered in that way. I mean, being a native of the city, having grown up there, I think that was a loving sort of composition that he did, that for me as a native reminds me of the city and its beauty, its architecture. I also love many of the crowd scenes that he does in Lafayette Square, and those were wonderful and wonderfully rendered images. He's able to capture the movement of the masses. He's able to capture the violence in such a way that I can still present it to younger audiences. And I thank him profoundly for doing that, because he understood what I really wanted to do was to broaden this audience that was going to be reading this particular text. And if it were too bloody and too gory, it would not be available to these younger audiences in that way.
And I think sets up a really good transition for us as we get into questions. I want to say this idea of being accessible to younger audiences is something that's important to both of you. You guys are both educators, and it fits in so well with Oscar Dunn's story, because education was maybe above all other things his most important cause, and definitely something that he achieved a great deal with. And we have a question here that Caitlin Vanderwolf, thank you for sharing. She asks, do you intend for this work to be utilized in classrooms, or do you anticipate publishing a teacher guide or curricular activities? One thing I want to start by saying is that if you go to hnoc.org/donate books, we have a program we've set up where you are allowed to donate amount of money that will allow us to get this book into classrooms and into libraries. But maybe, Brian, you can talk a bit about how important it is that this does find an audience with younger readers.
A lot of people think that what we do as historians merely is in the classroom, and when we aren't in a classroom, we're just writing books. But as a public historian, what I do is spend a lot of my time interacting with communities and interacting with secondary teachers. And what I discovered was that my experiences as a child are being replicated all over the country. People aren't talking about Reconstruction, even though Reconstruction explains critically how we got to the position we're in today in the United States. Teachers find this difficult because really they weren't taught about Reconstruction, so they feel uncomfortable talking about it. They lack information, so in many classrooms they merely skip Reconstruction and go straight from the Civil War to Jim Crow. And it's hard to understand Jim Crow without understanding what the backlash is against. And to help teachers out, I think that this is an excellent way for them to bring Reconstruction into the classroom and open up a discussion of Reconstruction.
I have another question here about one thing that comes up in the book is that there was an act passed in 1873 to erect a monument to Oscar Dunn that was passed, signed into law by Governor Kellogg, and of course it does not come to pass. And somebody asks, is there any conversation about creating a lasting monument to Dunn other than what we've done here? And I want to say that Brian and I have both been in conversation with the folks working on the City Council Street Renaming Commission, which recently has offered the recommendation to rename Washington Artillery Park, which is named for a Confederate unit, Oscar Dunn Park. My understanding is that still has to go through the City Council, but to answer that question, there is an effort underway. We are not directly involved in it, but we're both excited to see that folks in the city are beginning to understand the impact of Oscar Dunn's story. We have another question, Brian. You know, you've given a lot of talks to classrooms and in corporate settings, and I'm in our question here is, what surprises or observations have you encountered during your lectures in terms of people's concepts of Reconstruction, and if they even have a concept of it, how it connects to the issues we're facing today? Do you feel like people have a good understanding of this era?
No, not unless you're really a historian or avid reader of history. Do you really have a true concept of what Reconstruction was actually like? And that's not by mistake or happenstance. I mean, we were purposely, as a nation, taught an alternative narrative about Reconstruction and about the fitness of those individuals who took over, those first African Americans who had political positions. If you're going to drive people back into a pseudo slavery like position under Jim Crow, you can't have people like Dunn reminding people that they were capable, quite capable African Americans. So it became essential to bury those narratives in order to have this sort of lost cause narrative replace it. So it's no accident that we don't have individuals, or we don't have a lot of books about people, Reconstruction politicians or individuals like Dunn, because they are counter to the lost cause narrative that was introduced by Edward Pollard.
We have a couple of questions related to PBS Pinchback. One of them is about the news really made in this book, which is that Oscar Dunn is the first acting governor of the United States and not PBS Pinchback. And the question notes a lot of formalities related to PBS Pinchback's short 30-some day term as acting governor. Answer to the question about, you know, how is Oscar Dunn identified as the first acting governor is that although there was a lot of ceremony around PBS Pinchback because it happened during Warmoth's impeachment trial, both men became acting governor because of Article 53 of the 1868 Louisiana Constitution, which states in part, in case of impeachment of the governor, his removal from office, death, resignation, or absence from the state, which was the case with Oscar Dunn, the powers and duties of the office shall devolve upon the lieutenant governor. So there's no distinction within that constitutional article about whether one clause has primacy over the other. They both became acting governor as a result of Article 53. And Warmoth was never removed from office. As a matter of fact, when his term ended, the charges were dropped. So that's the answer to that. But Brian, you can address why maybe you think PBS Pinchback exists, is better known in public memory today than Oscar Dunn.
He outlived Dunn first. You know, he lived
by about 50 years.
Yes,
right?
he outlived Dunn. He continued to be a sort of person, a bon vivant, someone who was in the highlight, and a notable African American historian did a biography of Pinchback. It was not very successful, in that many people who were fully aware of Pinchback's historical sort of escapades noted that Haskins was his name, had left out many of these escapades and sort of glorified Pinchback. But the notion that Haskins brings Pinchback back to life after Reconstruction is one of the reasons why he is given this honor of being the first Black governor, acting governor. Had Haskins done his book on Dunn, he probably would have noted that Dunn had been actually the first acting governor. Unfortunately, he did his work on Pinchback instead.
Barrington, a question for you. What, you know, as a relative outsider to this history, was there any element of this that really caught you off guard that you didn't know about? And I'm curious, as an illustrator, what was your biggest surprise as you were learning about this story?
That's a great question. I think once I learned more about the story, everything seemed to make sense. The history, his connection, his Masonic relationships made sense. His connections, Dunn's, that is, connections to the Episcopal churches made sense. I think the thing that surprised me the most was the breadth and the scope of his connections to the political system across the country. The reverence that that Grant had for him, that President Grant had for him, had had an impact on me as I was drawing and thinking, wow. So here's one character that we know very, very well through history. And here's another character that I hadn't heard about until I, got offered to illustrate this book. And I think being someone who works in speculative fiction, my speculative mind starts to run. I'm like, wow, I start developing an alternative history. What would have happened, had he survived? What could have happened from this point? Because I was so impressed and so amazed by the depth and the possibilities that I was unaware of. And I consider myself someone who was pretty well educated in terms of history. I've had a good grounding in history, but of course there are stories that never make it past the surface or past a region. So yeah. I think that the scope was really important for me.
We have a really good question here for you, Brian, which is that did Dunn identify with the Anglo-African community more so than the Afro-Creole community? And did his identity help him become more of an intercessor between these two groups during Reconstruction, especially since, he was kind of this radical figure? And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how he navigated those two worlds.
Dunn is respected in both camps. So in both venues, in the Afro-Creole community, he is seen as a leader, and in the Anglo-African community is seen as a leader. What becomes the more important community politically is the community that has the most voters. And what he's able to control are the votes of the numerous former slaves. So even though he's respected in both communities, I believe it's his ability to control those votes of the Anglo-African community, which is far more numerous, is the thing that gives him more political power than some of the Afro-Creole, some of his Afro-Creole contemporaries that worked alongside him. When we talk about people like Francis Dumas, the two men knew each other, respected each other, were friends with each other. But a number of former slaves did not particularly trust that camp because he had once been a slave owner. So you could see where Dunn might have an advantage with that group, having been a slave himself.
And there was, and on a related note, you mentioned Dumas. We have a question here about really the relationship with the New Orleans Tribune, which is covered widely in our weekend of events. And the 1868 state election in particular, when Dunn and Francis Dumas went head to head for the lieutenant governorship, and it came to an ugly head. And the question here is, did you discover evidence that English-speaking Black men or Black people in New Orleans were drawn to the Tribune or put off by it, or were they indifferent to the Tribune? I'm not sure if you encountered any of that, but I'm curious what you might have to say to that.
Everyone had their own paper, and that's one of the interesting things when you look at Reconstruction New Orleans. Dunn, in his war against Warmouth, did not control appointments. So to make sure that his camp got money or received funding, what he realized that he could do was control the printing of government documents. And all of his friends opened up newspapers, and the budget for printing documents swelled in the state. But this was his way of, I guess, funneling to his base of support those individuals that just wouldn't vote for him without getting something. If they opened a newspaper, they had this ability to run documents and postings that the government put out. So every camp had their own newspaper. Every politician had a newspaper that encircled and wrote favorably about him. Unfortunately, the paper that wrote about Dunn was a relatively small paper called the Civic Guard. And the Civic Guard, just a few copies of it exist. And if any of you should be at the Historic New Orleans collection, there are a few copies of the Civic Guard. The Civic Guard was renamed, I believe, the National Republican after Dunn's death. And it's in the Civic Guard that I found the obituary that was written by Parsons. And Parson gives this very lengthy explanation of Dunn's origin. And there are really three obituaries that are written, and the authors of the three well, the authors of two of them are known, Parsons and Dryden. And Dryden had been the plasterer that Dunn had worked for that he had to dispute with. So Dunn really, would you prefer, who would have the better details on your life? A lifelong friend or an employer that you had a dispute with and probably haven't talked to since then? And
Right.
because Dryden was white and it ran in one of the white newspapers, that obit kept getting repeated over and over again. And the Parsons obit sort of falls out of favor, and no one's read it because no one really kept a lot of copies of the old Civic Guard after Dunn passed
And
away.
it's one of really the best sources that you uncovered that sheds so much detail about his early life. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question because we have a couple of questions and comments about Dunn's mysterious death. I'll quickly say that several doctors attended him during his brief and sudden illness. The official cause was congestion of the brain and lungs, but there was a wild conjecture in the immediate aftermath. We referenced the Thomas Morris Chester speech where he implies that PBS pinchback had something to do with it. And then a month after that, Chester is attacked in the presence of PBS pinchback, perhaps as retaliation. Obviously, there was never any resolution to what happened. An autopsy was denied by a family friend. But Brian, I think people want to hear, what do you think about what happened? Because we really don't know, but you're so connected to Dunn and this story. What are some of your thoughts?
I will give you my thoughts, but I have to tell you that they are speculated, that
Yeah.
I don't have a definitive answer for what happened to Dunn. He could have been poisoned. That's one of the potential things that could have happened to Dunn. I also believe that Pinchback may have successfully found information about Dunn. And one of the things that nobody had really, and they didn't talk about this during the period, Dunn had lived as a boarder in the house with Ellen Boyd and her previous husband. So Dunn lived with the Boyds prior to Dunn marrying Miss Boyd in 1866. And I believe that they may have, at least Pinchback's newspaper had threatened to run a story, because they had ran an article saying that we're going to come out with this very salacious story about Dunn right before Dunn dies. So there was always the potential that Dunn may have committed suicide rather than have this potential horrible story come out, sidetrack the entire political faction that he had started and the movement, and destroy his wife and children. So we may never know what happened. We may never actually find out. But Warmoth and Pinchback had a lot of reason to fear Dunn, and had a number of reasons to poison Dunn had they decided to do that.
And that's a mystery we will have to leave this session at. And I want to thank you, Brian and Barrington, so much, not just for participating today, but for the years of work you all have poured into this book, monumental, Oscar Dunn and his radical fight in Reconstruction Louisiana. I want to tell everybody in the audience that you can ask questions. Brian will be up with us tomorrow at the author Q&A at 4 o'clock. So bring your questions. I know you have them. You will get another chance to speak with him. And please tune in later this afternoon for our next session. I believe it's at 3 o'clock, and it'll be with Fatima Sheikh talking about her incredible book, Economy Hall. So we want to thank you all, Brian, Barrington, and everybody in the audience, everybody behind the scenes. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you all.